This
is Woodside Church Kids.
Hey everyone, welcome to this week's video. My name is Matty and this is for the kids in Engage. Last week, Vicky, using her teddies and a dog, told us the story of David being chosen by Samuel to be the next king of Israel, about how God looks at David's heart rather than how tall he was or how strong he was. God looks at what's inside of us. And this week we're looking at David again, but we're starting off when there's a bit of a fight happening between the Israelites and a people called the Philistines. And so I'm going to be reading from the book of 1 Samuel chapter 17. And it says that the Philistines mustered an army for battle. And Goliath was a Philistine champion. It means he was a really, really strong person who was much stronger than lots of other people in the army. In fact, he was over 9 feet tall. Now 9 feet is hard to imagine, but it's like my height plus another half of me. This is a really, really tall guy and he's really strong. He was over 9 feet tall and he wore bronze armour that was really, really heavy, and he had a massive spear, and someone else was walking in front of him carrying his shield. He walked out in front of all the Israelite army and said, "Why are you all coming out to fight? I am the Philistine champion. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we'll all be your slaves, but if I kill him, you will be our slaves." And when the Israelites heard him shout this at their army, they were terrified and they were deeply shaken, it says in the Bible. But David, three of his older brothers were part of the army already, so David would travel up carrying food for them. And for 40 days and evenings, Goliath went out and shouted at all the Israelites. Now one time when David went up to give food to his brothers, he heard the normal taunts from this Philistine giant for the people of Israel. He heard him shouting, and the Israelites began to run away because they were so scared. Now David asked some of the soldiers nearby, "Who is this pagan Philistine? Who is this person who doesn't believe in God anyway, that he is allowed to defy, who's allowed to stand against the armies of the living God?" Now the soldiers were all scared, and in fact David's brothers got quite annoyed at him for trying to get involved in this fight because they thought he was just there because he wanted to watch it happen. But David's questions got told to King Saul, and King Saul heard that he was asking. So he summoned David to come and see him. And David said to King Saul, "Don't worry about this Philistine, I'll go fight him." And Saul was quite surprised. He said, "That's ridiculous. You're a boy and he's been fighting for battle ever since he was really, really young." But David didn't do this because he thought he could do it himself. He knew that God would help him. He said, "Look, when a lion or bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock," because he was a shepherd, he would fight them off. And he said that the Lord had rescued him from the claws of the lions and the bears that came to steal his sheep, and the Lord will rescue him from this Philistine giant Goliath. And so Saul said, all right, go ahead. And he tried to give David his armour, but David put it on and it wasn't right. It was way too big and it was way too heavy, and David was like, I can't fight in this. I'm not used to wearing this armour. So he took it all off and he just took his staff and he took a sling and picked some rocks up from a nearby lake. And so he walked over on the battlefield and started strolling towards Goliath. Goliath shouted at him, said, "Come over here and I'll give your flesh to the birds. I'm going to kill you." But David shouted back and said, "Look, you come at me with a sword and a spear, but I come at you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies. I come to you in the name of God." He said, "The whole world will know that there is a God in Israel, and this is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us." As Goliath ran close to attack, David ran to him as well, and he took out one of the stones from in his bag, put it in his sling, and spun it around his head and fired this stone straight at Goliath. And it smacked him straight in the forehead and dug into his head, and Goliath stumbled, staggered a little bit, and then just fell face down into the ground. David had triumphed over this Philistine. David, who was a much smaller boy who hadn't learnt how to battle against people in an army, had managed to defeat this giant champion Goliath because he trusted that God would be with him. He wasn't fighting Goliath by himself. He was fighting Goliath in the name of God. And the Philistines saw that Goliath had been killed, and they tried to run away, but the Israelites chased them down, shouting in triumph that they've managed to defeat this army. And that's the story of David and Goliath. Now, I've got a couple of points from this story that are still apply to us today. The first is that God had helped David before. See, David was a shepherd, as we learned about last week. He would look after sheep, and sometimes wild animals would come to try and eat those sheep, and David would have to fight them off. See, God had helped David to fight lions and bears before, so David knew that he could trust God to protect him. My second point is that Goliath was pretty scary, but David knew that it wasn't really him fighting against Goliath, it was God fighting through him. See, God is much bigger and much scarier than anything that we can come up against. Goliath was scary and big, but God is so much bigger than anything. And the third point is that in this story, David is kind of like Jesus. See, Jesus fought against a pretty scary enemy as well, and that scary enemy was called death. And Jesus fought against death and defeated death. See, in this story with David and Goliath, David was one man from an army fighting against Goliath. But when David won the battle, it wasn't only him that won, it was all of the Israelites as well. He was the champion for the Israelite army. And Jesus is our champion today. Jesus went and fought against death so that we can celebrate and triumph with him, so that we can have a relationship with God and we can have an everlasting life. We can live forever with God in heaven. And that's why this story is still really important and still applies for us today in our circumstances, in our situations. See, we come up with scary things day to day. We come up with friends who've been mean and we feel like we need to talk to them, and that's quite scary because they might not like what we have to say. Or we might need to speak in front of a group of people and you're not very confident. But in all of these things, we can know that God will help us and we can ask him to help and he'll be with us. And so, to summarise our story, I've got 3 quick questions, just as a little quiz to see if you were paying attention. The first question is, what were the Israelites fighting against? That's right, the Israelites were fighting against an enemy called the Philistines, who were another group of people. My second question is, how tall was Goliath? Yeah, the Bible says that he was a giant, but Goliath was actually over 9 foot tall. That's just over me plus half of me, which is pretty massive, and he was probably much wider than I was as well, and really muscly. And my third question is, what was the king in our story called? Well, if you said King Saul, you are absolutely right. King Saul was someone that had been chosen by God to lead Israel, but David was going to be the next king, so we find out a little bit more about how that story unfolds in the next few weeks. And this week in Woodside Kids Weekly, I've put together some challenges for you to try, some activity sheets and some crafts. And as always, I would love to see the stuff you get up to during the week. So if you get up to anything that you want to share, send me a photo or possibly even a video, and I'll try and get them in next week's materials. So until next week, stay safe, love one another, and chat to Jesus. Bye!